Millionaire shocked after hugged by black beggar by mistake on empty street. Richard Sterling, a name whispered with awe and a healthy dose of fear on Wall Street, stepped out of his roles. Rain slicked the cobblestones of a back alley in Greenwich Village, reflecting the neon glow of a distant bar. He needed air, space, away from the suffocating smiles and back-patting at the charity gala he was sponsoring. Tonight, the memories of Emily, his late wife, hit him like a sucker punch. Her belief in good, in people, a stark contrast to the sharks he swam with daily. Suddenly, a figure darted from the shadows. A young woman, bundled in clothes that looked 3 sizes too big and 10 years too old. Before Richard could react, she'd thrown her arms around him, a desperate sob escaping her lips. "Thank you! You saved us!" Richard recoiled, disgust warring with something else. Her touch, however brief, was shockingly warm against the cold armor he wore. He ripped himself free, his $1,000 suit now sporting a smudge of something. "Get away from me," he snarled, more out of reflex than actual anger. The woman stumbled back, her eyes widening in horror. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I thought you were someone else." He took a closer look. Her face, beneath the grime, was young, desperate, real. He saw a flicker of something that reminded him, damn it, of Emily. Hope. "Who did you think I was?" he asked, the question surprising even himself. She wrung her hands, her voice barely a whisper. "Someone who promised to help my brother, Ethan. He's trying to save our family's diner." But Richard, against every instinct, screaming at him to get back in the car and forget this ever happened, found himself intrigued. He waved off his driver. "Tell me about it." And she did, a story of rising rents, ruthless developers, and a family clinging to a dream. The villain? A guy named Caldwell. A name Richard knew too well. Caldwell, who was determined to tear down the diner and build luxury condos. An opportunity? Maybe. But something else gnawed at Richard. Caldwell's determination seemed excessive, almost personal. And then there was the hug, that brief, desperate embrace. Why did it feel so damn familiar? Like a ghost of a memory, stirring something he thought he'd buried long ago. A secret. A secret that Caldwell was clearly desperate to keep hidden. Why was Caldwell so determined to destroy this little diner? And what was the connection between this girl, this diner, and the carefully constructed empire Richard had spent his life building? This was more than just a business deal. This was personal. E antes de continuarmos com essa história incrível, preciso te fazer alerta importante. Muitos inscritos têm relatado que o YouTube removeu suas inscrições sem aviso. Dá só uma conferida rápida no botão vermelho aí embaixo para garantir que você ainda está inscrito no canal. Não quero que você perca nenhum conteúdo exclusivo que vem por aí. E já que você está aí, deixa aquele like poderoso que me ajuda muito com o algoritmo. E me conta nos comentários de qual cidade você está assistindo. Adoro conhecer cada pessoa incrível que faz parte dessa comunidade. Sua participação faz toda a diferença. Vamos interagir. Why was Caldwell so determined to destroy this little diner? And what was the connection between this girl, this diner, and the carefully constructed empire Richard had spent his life building? This was more than just a business deal. This was personal. Okay, so rising ranks, right? Caldwell's behind it all. He owns the building, she began, her voice shaking slightly. He's been making things impossible for months. My brother, Ethan, he's been working day and night, but it's not enough. Richard listened, really listened. He saw the weariness in her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw. He recognized that look. He'd seen it in Emily. Grit. He pulled out his phone, punched in a number. Sarah, get me everything you have on Caldwell. Everything. And I mean everything. He snapped the phone shut. Okay, kid, let's get some coffee. Tell me everything about this diner. They walked to a small, all-night coffee shop a few blocks away. She told him about the diner, about her family, about Ethan's dreams of keeping it alive. It was more than just a business, she explained. It was a piece of their history, a place where everyone in the neighborhood felt like they belonged. Richard found himself captivated. He hadn't felt this alive in years. Suddenly, the door of the coffee shop burst open. A man, tall and imposing, strode in, his face contorted with rage. Caldwell. You, he roared, pointing a finger at the girl. You think you can go running to him? You think that's going to stop me? Richard stood up. His eyes narrowed. Caldwell. What a surprise. Caldwell ignored him, his focus solely on the girl. You and your pathetic diner are going down. You hear me? Down. Leave her alone, Caldwell, Richard said, his voice dangerously low. Caldwell finally turned his attention to Richard, a sneer twisting his lips. Stay out of this, Sterling. This is business. This, Richard said, gesturing to the girl, is personal. Caldwell laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Personal? What could you possibly know about personal? And then it happened. A woman, older, but with the same haunted eyes as the girl, pushed her way through the crowd that had gathered at the door. She stared at Richard, her face pale. Richard? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Is that really you? Richard froze. He hadn't seen this woman in over 30 years. He thought she was dead. Mom? The girl whispered, turning to the older woman. The woman shook her head, her eyes still fixed on Richard. No, honey. That's your father. The coffee shop went silent. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He stared at the girl, at the woman, back at Caldwell, whose sneer had now morphed into a look of utter shock. 30 years. A secret he thought he buried. A family he never knew he had. And all because of a hug. What are you saying? The girl stammered, her eyes wide with disbelief. Richard couldn't speak. He looked at the diner, at Caldwell, at the pieces of the puzzle suddenly falling into place. Caldwell wasn't just trying to tear down the diner. He was trying to erase a past. Their past. He was trying to protect a secret that could destroy everything. And Richard, in his quest to help a stranger, had just stumbled upon the biggest, most shocking truth of his life. But the question that burned in his mind was, why had his own mother kept this hidden from him? The coffee shop went silent. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He stared at the girl, at the woman, back at Caldwell, whose sneer had now morphed into a look of utter shock. 30 years. A secret he thought he buried. A family he never knew he had. And all because of a hug. What "What are you saying?" the girl stammered, her eyes wide with disbelief. Richard couldn't speak. He looked at the diner, at Caldwell, at the pieces of the puzzle suddenly falling into place. Caldwell wasn't just trying to tear down the diner. He was trying to erase their past. He was trying to protect a secret that could destroy everything. And Richard, in his quest to help a stranger, had just stumbled upon the biggest, most shocking truth of his life. But the question that burned in his mind was, why had his own mother kept this hidden from him? Suddenly, the older woman, Mom, found her voice. It was shaky, but firm. "It's true, honey. He's your father." The girl, who Richard now knew was likely named something like Sarah, looked like she'd been slapped hard. She swayed, and Ethan, a burly guy who'd materialized from somewhere, caught her. Caldwell, meanwhile, was losing it. His face was purple, veins bulging in his neck. "This changes nothing," he roared. "Nothing. That diner is coming down." Richard finally found his voice, a low growl. "You're not touching it, Caldwell." "Oh, I'm not? What are you going to do about it, Sterling? Buy it? Throw your money around? That's all you're good for." That's when it happened. The older woman, Mom, stepped forward, her eyes blazing with a fire Richard had never seen before. She pulled something from her purse. Small, shiny, a gun. Everyone gasped. Even Caldwell shut his mouth. "Get away from my family," she said, her voice ice cold. The gun was pointed straight at Caldwell's heart. Richard's mind was racing. Mom? With a gun? What the hell was going on? Caldwell, surprisingly, didn't back down. He just laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You wouldn't," he sneered. "You don't have the guts." "Don't test me," Mom said. Her hand was shaking, but the gun didn't waver. Then everything went to hell. A shot rang out, but it didn't come from Mom's gun. Someone else in the coffee shop, a man in a dark coat who'd been sitting quietly in the corner, had pulled a gun and fired. Not at Caldwell, at Richard. Richard felt a searing pain in his chest, saw a flash of light, and then everything went black. As he fell, he heard a scream. "Sarah? Mom?" He couldn't tell. He just knew one thing. He'd walked into something way bigger than rising rents and ruthless developers. He'd walked into a war, and he had a feeling it was just getting started. But by whom and why? Was it Caldwell's doing to get rid of both the family and Richard's interference? Or was it something far more sinister, connected to the secret Caldwell was so desperate to keep buried? A secret Richard was now paying the ultimate price for discovering. Richard felt a searing pain in his chest, saw a flash of light, and then everything went black. As he fell, he heard a scream. "Sarah? Mom?" He couldn't tell. He just knew one thing. He'd walked into something way bigger than rising rents and ruthless developers. He'd walked into a war, and he had a feeling it was just getting started. But by whom and why? Was it Caldwell's doing to get rid of both the family and Richard's interference? Or was it something far more sinister, connected to the secret Caldwell was so desperate to keep buried? A secret Richard was now paying the ultimate price for discovering. Then, nothing. He woke up to the beep. A steady, insistent beep. Hospital. He recognized the smell, the sterile, antiseptic air. He tried to move, but pain shot through his chest. He opened his eyes. White ceiling. Machines. Tubes. A nurse rushed over. "Mr. Sterling, you're awake!" He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. "Sarah? Mom?" A nurse frowned. "Just rest, Mr. Sterling. You've been through a lot." She wouldn't tell him anything. He closed his eyes, drifting back into the darkness. When he woke again, he was alone. The pain was still there, but it was manageable. He focused, trying to remember. The diner. Caldwell. The gun. The girl. His daughter. He had a daughter. The door creaked open. A figure stepped in. He tensed, ready for anything. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't Mom. It was Caldwell. But Caldwell wasn't smirking. He wasn't angry. He looked defeated, scared. "Sterling," he said, his voice hoarse, "we need to talk." Richard glared. "Talk? You tried to have me killed." Caldwell shook his head. No, I didn't. I swear I didn't." "Then who did?" Caldwell hesitated, then looked around the room as if afraid someone was listening. He leaned closer. It was your mother, Richard." Richard stared, disbelieving. "My what? That's insane." "No, it's true. I saw her. She hired the guy, the shooter, the whole thing. But the bullet was meant for me." "You're lying," Richard rasped, struggling to sit up. "I wish I was. She's been playing us all along, Richard. She used you to get to me." He paused, swallowed hard. "She wants something I have, something I can't give back." "What? What are you talking about? What could my mother possibly want from you?" Caldwell's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "She wants her legacy." "Legacy? What legacy?" This made no sense. "She wants to take something precious," Caldwell said, his voice cracking. "But it's more than that. It's about revenge, Richard. It's always been about revenge. A 30-year plan she hatched to ruin me for reasons you couldn't possibly imagine." Then the door swung open again, and Mom stepped into the room. But she wasn't alone. Behind her stood Sarah, but Sarah wasn't looking at Richard. She was looking at Caldwell, and in her hand she held a gun. "Sorry, Mr. Caldwell," Sarah said, her voice cold and devoid of any emotion. Something completely different from that young woman from before. "But family comes first." Richard stared in horror. What was going on? Was this some kind of twisted game? Was Sarah really going to shoot Caldwell? Then Sarah turned the gun. Not at Caldwell. At Richard. "You were a loose end, Dad," she said, her voice flat, her eyes empty. "Mom didn't want you finding out the truth. You were too dangerous." And then Richard knew. He understood everything. The hug wasn't a mistake. It was a setup, a way to get him involved, a way to use him. He'd been played, not just by Caldwell, but by his own mother and his own daughter. The biggest shock of his life wasn't finding out he had a family. It was realizing that his family wanted him dead. Before he could react, Sarah fired. Before he could react, Sarah fired. The bullet ripped through the air, but it didn't hit Richard. Instead, it slammed into Caldwell. He crumpled like a puppet with its strings cut. his eyes wide with disbelief as he hit the floor. Dead. Sarah stood there, gun still smoking, her face blank. Then she turned to her grandmother. "He knew too much," she said, her voice flat. "He had to be silenced." Richard was stunned. This wasn't some act of revenge against him. It was something else entirely. Something bigger. What is going on?" he stammered, his head swimming. His mother stepped forward, a strange, almost triumphant look on her face. "Don't you see, Richard? This isn't about the diner. It's never been about the diner." She paused, her eyes gleaming with a cold light. "It's about power and control." Suddenly, things clicked into place. The ruthlessness, the meticulous planning, the way everyone seemed to be dancing to her tune. His mother, she wasn't just a sweet old lady protecting her family. She was a mastermind. You used me," Richard said, his voice hoarse. "Of course I did, honey," she said, her voice sickeningly sweet. "You were the perfect pawn, rich, powerful, and naive enough to believe my little act." She gestured to Sarah. "And Sarah here is my star player. She's been trained for this her whole life." Sarah just stared back at him, her eyes devoid of any warmth or affection. She was a weapon, a tool. Richard felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He'd spent his life building an empire, battling sharks on Wall Street, but he'd been completely outmaneuvered by his own mother. "But why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. His mother smiled, a chillingly beautiful smile. "Because, Richard, some legacies are worth more than money. Some legacies are worth everything." Then she leaned in close, her voice a soft, menacing whisper. "And now, darling, you're part of it, whether you like it or not." But just as she said that, another door to the room burst open. In ran two police officers, guns drawn. Someone must have called them after the first shot. "Freeze! Put your hands where we can see them," one of the officers yelled. Everything went silent. The police were there. It should be over. But the look on his mother's face said it wasn't. Before anyone could react, his mother did something completely insane. She grabbed Sarah's gun, pointed it at Richard, and screamed, "He made me do it! He's the one you want!" Then, before the cops had any clue what was going on, she pulled the trigger. But the chamber was empty. So as she screamed a guttural sound of frustration, she tossed the gun to the floor. All eyes were on him aghast, and he felt the bullet sink into his chest. Again, "Freeze! Put your hands where we can see them," one of the officers yelled. Everything went silent. The police were there. It should be over. But the look on his mother's face said it wasn't. Before anyone could react, his mother did something completely insane. She grabbed Sarah's gun, pointed it at Richard, and screamed, "He made me do it! He's the one you want!" Then, before the cops had any clue what was going on, she pulled the trigger. But the chamber was empty. So, as she screamed a guttural sound of frustration, she tossed the gun to the floor. All eyes were on him, aghast, and he felt the bullets sink into his chest again, except they didn't. He was standing, still breathing, confused as hell. Then he looked down and saw her, Mom, collapsed on the floor, a spreading stain blooming on her chest. Sarah was screaming, a high-pitched, keening wail that ripped through the sterile air of the hospital room. The cops were yelling, wrestling Sarah to the ground. Chaos. Utter chaos. But Richard, he couldn't take his eyes off his mother. He knelt beside her, his hand hovering, afraid to touch. Her eyes flickered open. "Richard," she gasped, her voice a bare whisper. I had to." "Why, Mom? Why?" he choked out, tears stinging his eyes. She reached up, her frail hand clutching his. "It wasn't for me." Then she coughed, a wet, rattling cough. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth. "It was for him," she managed, her gaze fixed on something beyond him. Richard followed her gaze to the door, where a figure stood silhouetted against the harsh hospital hallway lights. A figure he recognized. Ethan, Sarah's brother. But Ethan wasn't looking at Richard. He was looking at Sarah, his face a mask of cold, calculating satisfaction. He raised his hand slightly, a barely perceptible signal. And then it hit Richard, like a punch to the gut. Ethan, not Sarah. Ethan was the star player. Ethan was the one pulling the strings. All this time, he'd been so focused on Caldwell, on his mother, on Sarah. He'd completely missed the real puppeteer. His mother's last words echoed in his mind. It was for him. She hadn't been protecting herself. She'd been protecting Ethan. But why? Then, as if reading his mind, Ethan smiled. A slow, chilling smile that revealed the monster lurking beneath the surface. He opened his mouth and spoke, his voice clear and strong, carrying easily across the room. "Checkmate, Dad." Dad? Richard's world tilted on its axis. He thought he knew shattered into a million pieces. His mother hadn't been protecting him from Ethan. She'd been protecting Ethan for him. Ethan was his son too. And suddenly, everything made sense. The relentless focus on the diner, Caldwell's desperation, his mother's intricate planning. It was all about setting Ethan up, giving him the power, the resources, the legacy he believed he deserved. But how? When? He looked back at his mother, her eyes now vacant, her grip on his hand slackening. The weight of her lies, of her manipulations, crashed down on him. He had 2 children, both manipulated to extremes, and he would not have known anything if he did not decide to stick his nose where it did not belong. And Ethan, standing there, watching the scene unfold with that unsettling smile. He was the ultimate gamble, the heir apparent to a twisted empire built on secrets and lies. "What? What is this?" Richard stammered, his voice trembling. Ethan just chuckled. "You'll find out, Dad. You'll find out everything." Then, with a final, dismissive glance, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the chaos of the hospital hallway. Richard was left kneeling beside his dead mother, his daughter screaming in the arms of the police, and the chilling realization that he hadn't just stumbled into a war. He'd fathered it. And the worst part? He had no idea what Ethan's next move was, or how to stop him. Richard was left kneeling beside his dead mother, his daughter screaming in the arms of the police, and the chilling realization that he hadn't just stumbled into a war. He'd fathered it. And the worst part, he had no idea what Ethan's next move was, or how to stop him. The cops finally managed to drag Sarah away, her screams echoing down the hallway. Someone threw a blanket over Caldwell's body. The room smelled like blood and antiseptic and despair. Richard just stayed there, kneeling, numb. "Mr. Sterling?" A young cop, barely out of his teens, touched his arm. "Sir, we need you to come with us." Richard didn't resist. He let them lead him away, past the flashing lights and the hushed whispers. He was a ghost, walking through his own life. They took him to a small, windowless room and left him alone. He sat there for hours, staring at the blank wall, his mind a swirling vortex of confusion and horror. A daughter he didn't know, a son he didn't know, a mother who was a cold-blooded killer. His life, his carefully constructed empire, was a lie. A house of cards about to collapse. Then the door opened, and a woman walked in. He didn't recognize her at first. She was older, her face etched with lines he didn't remember. "Emily?" he whispered, his voice cracking. His late wife. Emily. But that was impossible. Emily had died 10 years ago, in a car accident. He'd seen her. He'd held her hand as she— "Richard," she said, her voice soft, achingly familiar. "It's me." He stared at her, his mind reeling. But you're dead. I saw the car, the hospital." She shook her head, a sad smile on her lips. "It was a long time ago, Richard. A very long time ago." "But how? Why?" "It's a complicated story, Richard. One that starts long before you and I ever met." She paused, took a deep breath. "My name isn't Emily. It never was." He stared, dumbfounded. What are you saying? "My real name is Eleanor," she whispered. Her eyes filled with a sorrow he'd never seen before. "And I'm Ethan's mother." The words hit him like a physical blow. Ethan's mother? But that meant he's not? "No, Richard. Ethan isn't your son. He's mine. And Caldwell was my brother." The world swam. Nothing made sense. His dead wife, alive. His son, not his son. His enemy, his brother-in-law. But the diner, all of this? It was never about the diner, Richard. It was about revenge. Caldwell stole something from me a long time ago. Something I could never forgive. She stepped closer, her eyes burning with a fierce intensity. "He stole my son. He took Ethan from me when he was just a baby and gave him to another family. I spent years searching for him, and when I finally found him, I knew I had to make Caldwell pay." "And you used me?" Richard croaked, his voice barely audible. "I did what I had to do, Richard. I'm sorry. But Ethan, he's all I have left." But if Ethan was Emily/Eleanor's son, and Caldwell was her brother, then everything. "Then that hug with Sarah," he croaked. "It was you who ordered her to embrace me. You ordered her to act." Eleanor nodded and started to weep. "I needed to see if you were the man I once knew, or some monster. I'm afraid it was a test you passed with flying colors." Richard struggled to his feet, his head spinning. He had to get out of there. He had to find Ethan. But as he reached the door, Eleanor grabbed his arm. "Richard, you can't go after him. You don't understand what he's capable of. He's going to hurt someone," Richard said, his voice hoarse. "He won't hurt anyone who doesn't deserve it. Ethan is doing what needs to be done. Eleanor's jaw locked. What needs to be done? What are you talking about? Eleanor looked down, her face pale and drawn. She took a deep breath. It's time you knew the truth, Richard. The real truth. Caldwell wasn't just my brother. He was part of something bigger. Something much, much bigger than you can imagine. He was part of a secret society, a cabal of powerful men who control the world from the shadows. Richard stared, incredulous. A secret society? What are you talking about? They call themselves the Architects, Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. And they're responsible for everything. Wars, famines, economic collapses. They orchestrate it all. And then, the most shocking thing of all, Eleanor pulls back her jacket to reveal a tattoo on her shoulder. A complex symbol made of interlocking lines and circles. Richard recognized the symbol. He'd seen it before. On Caldwell's briefcase. On a ring he'd noticed another time on a high-level business contact. You're one of them? Richard stutters. But you were so opposed to Caldwell's plan. Eleanor shakes her head. No, I was born into the Architects. But my father died, and I inherited his seat. I have been at war with them ever since they stole Ethan from me. I used the society to my advantage. To protect you. To protect Ethan. She pauses for a heartbeat. Then a tear streaks down her face as she takes Richard's hand. He can't process the reality. And you, Richard, she says, her eyes pleading. You're the only one who can help me stop them. Because Richard is not, or rather was not, just a rich financier. His family, his real family, was one of the founder families of the Architects. And he has the one thing the society needs to fully set their plans into action. He holds the key to everything, and he doesn't even know it yet. And you, Richard, she says, her eyes pleading, you're the only one who can help me stop them, because Richard is not, or rather was not, just a rich financier. His family, his real family, was one of the founder families of the Architects, and he has the one thing the society needs to fully set their plans into action. He holds the key to everything, and he doesn't even know it yet. Richard stared at Eleanor. Everything was crumbling. His life, his memories. Were they even real? The car accident. Emily? Eleanor? It had to be a lie. A massive, devastating lie. He backed away from her, shaking his head. I don't understand. What key? What are you talking about? Eleanor reached out, her hand trembling. There's a lineage, a bloodline. You carry a marker, Richard. A genetic sequence that only activates at a certain point, a specific moment in time. They need your blood to unlock something powerful. He felt a cold dread creep into his bones. This was insane. A secret society, a bloodline, a genetic key. It was the stuff of bad movies. But he knew, deep down, that Eleanor was telling the truth. Her desperation was real. The fear in her eyes. He'd seen that before, in Emily's eyes, right before he squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the memories. He couldn't think. He needed to get out of here. He had to find Ethan. Suddenly, the door to the small room slammed open. It wasn't the police this time. It was two men dressed in black suits, their faces grim. They moved with a chilling efficiency, their eyes scanning the room. "Eleanor," one of them said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "It's time." Eleanor gasped, her eyes widening in terror. "No, you can't! I won't let you!" Richard stepped in front of her, his fists clenched. "Get out of here! This is police business." The men ignored him, their gaze fixed on Eleanor. "The council has spoken. You have failed us. You have betrayed us." "I did what I had to do," Eleanor cried, her voice cracking. "To protect my son." One of the men pulled out a gun. It was small, black, and deadly. Richard knew he had to do something. He lunged forward, grabbing the man's arm. They struggled for a moment, the gun waving wildly in the air. Then it fired. The bullet ripped through the air, hitting not Eleanor, not Richard, but one of the men in black. The other man stood frozen, his eyes wide with shock. Richard looked down at the body on the floor, then back at the gun in his hand. It was shaking. He'd never held a gun before in his life. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from behind the doorway. A figure Richard recognized. It was Ethan. But something was different about him. His eyes, they were cold, calculating, empty. He raised his hand, and the man in black, the one who hadn't been shot, immediately dropped to his knees. "Ethan?" Richard stammered, his voice trembling. What is going on?" Ethan smiled, a slow, chilling smile that sent a shiver down Richard's spine. "You should have listened to your mother, Dad. You should have stayed out of this." Then he snapped his fingers, and the world went black. When Richard came to, his head was throbbing. He was lying on something cold and hard, concrete. He tried to move, but his hands and feet were tied. He was in a warehouse, he guessed, dark, damp, and smelled like mildew. He blinked, trying to focus. Across the room, under a single flickering bulb, he saw them, Eleanor and Ethan. They were talking, their voices low and intense. He couldn't make out the words, but he could see their faces. Eleanor looked resigned, defeated. Ethan, on the other hand, was practically radiating power. Then Ethan turned and saw him. A slow smile spread across his face. "Ah, Dad, you're awake. Good." Richard tried to say something, but his mouth was gagged. Ethan walked over, kneeling beside him. "I'm sorry it had to be this way," he said, his voice almost sympathetic. "But you were getting too close. You were asking too many questions." He reached out and stroked Richard's cheek. It was a chillingly intimate gesture. "You know, I always wondered about you. About us. I wanted a dad like you. But you knew I was there all along. It was never your intention to look for me." Richard's eyes said as much as he could not speak the words. Ethan laughed, a short, hollow sound. "Don't be ridiculous, Dad. You're too old, a tool. Besides, Mom and I have been working on this for years. We've been planning this. Everything was calculated." He stood up and walked back to Eleanor. "It's time," he said, his voice hard. Eleanor shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. "Ethan, please, don't do this. There has to be another way." "There isn't, Mom. He knows too much. He's a liability. And besides," he added, his voice dropping to a whisper, "he has what we need." Eleanor closed her eyes, as if steeling herself. She took a deep breath and walked over to Richard. In her hand, she held a syringe. Richard's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew what she was going to do. She was going to take his blood. She was going to give it to the architects. He struggled against his bonds, but it was no use. He couldn't move. He could only watch as Eleanor approached, her face a mask of sorrow. "I'm so sorry, Richard," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted this for you." Then she plunged the needle into his arm. The pain was sharp and searing. He gritted his teeth, trying not to scream. He felt the blood draining from his body, flowing into the syringe. When the syringe was full, Eleanor pulled it out. She looked at it for a moment, her eyes filled with regret. Then she turned to Ethan. "Here," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's done." Ethan took the syringe from her hand. He held it up to the light, examining it carefully. "Good," he said, his voice cold. "Now it's time to finish this." He turned to the man in black, who was still kneeling on the floor, his face pale with fear. "Take him," Ethan commanded, gesturing to Richard. "Get rid of him." The man nodded and rose to his feet. He walked over to Richard and grabbed him by the arm, yanking him to his feet. Richard stumbled, his head spinning. He was weak, disoriented. He knew he was going to die. He closed his eyes, bracing himself. Then he heard a scream of pure, unadulterated rage. He opened his eyes, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Eleanor. She wasn't looking at the man in black. She wasn't looking at Ethan. She was looking at him. And in her hand, she held a knife. But not just any knife. It was a long, curved blade, made of some dark, gleaming metal. A blade Richard had seen before, in his dreams, in his nightmares. The knife that belonged to the architects, the blade wielded by the heads of the high table. The knife used for sacrifices. Eleanor lunged. Not at the man in black, not at Ethan, at him. She raised the knife above her head, her eyes blazing with a terrifying intensity. "You were a mistake, Richard," she screamed, her voice filled with a hatred he'd never imagined. "You should never have been born." And then, just as the knife began to descend, a voice cut through the air, a voice that stopped everyone in their tracks. "Mom, stop!" It was Ethan, but something was wrong. His voice, it wasn't cold, it wasn't calculating. It was filled with fear, and his eyes, they weren't empty. They were filled with tears. He stared at Eleanor, his face a mask of horror. "You can't do this," he cried, his voice breaking. He's my brother." Ethan dizendo aquilo. "Irmão?" Eleanor paralisou, a faca tremendo na mão. O ódio sumindo. Dúvida, medo. Estava ali, claro, nos olhos dela. "Não, não pode ser", ela murmurou, a voz fraca. Ethan avançou, ignorando o homem de preto, ignorando tudo. "É verdade, mãe. Eu descobri. Caldwell, ele me contou antes de morrer. Ele disse que Richard era meu irmão." O silêncio, pesado, a faca caindo. Eleanor desabou, um mar de lágrimas lavando o rosto. Richard, chocado. "Irmão? Ethan, seu irmão? A vida, Um nó que não dava para desfazer. O homem de preto, confuso, olhou para Ethan. What shall we do? Ethan, a decision. Rápida, mortal, lévia. E com um aceno de cabeça, a vida de Eleanor acabou. Um tiro, silêncio de novo. Só o choro de Ethan. Richard, peso. A cena, irreal. A mãe, morta. O irmão, um monstro. Um sorriso triste no rosto. Sinto muito, Richard. Mas era o único jeito. Ela estava cega. Não via o bem maior. O bem maior? O que você fez é loucura, Richard gritou, a voz rouca. Ethan deu de ombros. Loucura? Talvez. Mas é o nosso destino. Destino da nossa família. E então, o mais chocante. Ethan estendeu a mão. Junte-se a mim, Richard. Juntos podemos mudar o mundo. Mudar o mundo? Com violência? Com mentiras? Richard não podia, não queria. Nunca, ele disse, a voz firme. Ethan suspirou. Que pena. Eu realmente queria um irmão ao meu lado. E com um último olhar, Ethan se foi, levando consigo a verdade ou mais uma mentira. Richard ali, sozinho, amarrado, o futuro incerto. Ele conseguiu escapar, claro. Denunciou tudo. Mas era tarde demais? Os arquitetos ainda estavam lá. Ethan, solto. Richard não sabia. Só sabia que a guerra não tinha acabado. Apenas começado. E ele estava no meio. De novo, o que vai acontecer? A verdade sobre os arquitetos será revelada? Richard vai conseguir impedir Ethan? Você precisa se inscrever agora no canal para não perder as próximas histórias exclusivas. Esmague o botão de like agora para alimentar o algoritmo. Este é o momento para demonstrar seu apoio. Inunde a seção de comentários com suas reações e teorias sobre o final. Não espere nem mais um segundo para compartilhar este vídeo com pelo menos 5 amigos que precisam conhecer este desfecho. Apenas os verdadeiros fãs compreendem a importância de apoiar o canal com estas ações. Faça isso agora!